Welcome to Terror in Tandem, a podcast about finding entertainment in the macabre, hosted by the knowledgeable and lovable Laura and Richard Mathiasen. Each episode, we discuss the horror genre, from books to film to TV and beyond, sometimes even from the beyond. You can find us on YouTube and on Instagram at Terror in Tandem, and you will always find our latest episode on our website, terrorintandem.com. Hi. Oh, God.
Hello.
Scary faces.
Yeah, I've been making them the whole time you've been doing the intro.
Glad I didn't look.
Yeah.
Because they were scary.
Oh, yeah.
Ah!
Changing them up.
You're still doing
It's just
it.
a regular face.
Oh.
That's mean.
Sorry. Hi.
That's why I won't be on YouTube.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good afternoon and good evening to all of you listening.
Good day to all. What are we up to these days? An update from Tandem headquarters?
Yeah, we're just working on some new episodes.
Living large.
I think we're going to be coming up with a new series at
Really?
some point. Yeah.
This is news to co-host, or it might have been told to me, and I forgot. Both equally plausible.
Which is a great segue into a series we like to call Deep Diving into Directors.
Deep diving into directors, a new installment.
It's old. Oh, a new installment of the series.
Previously, we've tackled such luminaries as John Carpenter,
Jean-Luc Carpenter,
Wes Craven. We did. That was very good. Jean-Luc Carpenter, of course.
We'll mention these folks as we do this episode, actually, because they are
Contemporaries. Yeah.
affiliated.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a few different interesting ways.
Well,
but we're going to talk today about Tobe Hooper.
diving into Willard Tobe Hooper.
Is it Willard?
His first name is Willard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
he just went with Tobe.
He went with Tobe because Willard, a choice between Willard and Tobe. Yeah. He made a choice. Funny you should say Tobe because I did think it was pronounced that way for a while until someone else said his name out loud in front of me and I was like, what?
Yeah.
I thought it was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre brought to you by Tobe Hooper.
Nope, Tobe.
No, it's Tobe. And that concludes our deep dive, everybody. Good
you
night.
Also thought that the production company, the horror production company, which one was it that you thought was pronounced a certain way?
Blumhouse.
Yeah.
I thought it was a Blumhouse. Because Jason Blum, I don't know. It just seems like...
Jason Blum.
I know. And he's a very talented man.
And it's spelled
made
Blum.
a lot of good stuff, but I wonder if his drive has come from the fact...
There's no umlauts over the U.
I wonder if his drive to succeed came from being saddled at an early age with a name like Blum.
Yeah, it's like, I'm going to be better than Blum.
You are one syllable off Blumpkin,
Just
my
like
friend.
Tobe.
Yeah.
He puts the Y in horror.
Well, anyway, this has been name talk. I'm excited about this. This was not my idea. You are the one who suggested we do Tobe Hooper, and I have to admit, I was surprised because Tobe Hooper is not easy to classify.
Yeah, he's not... It wasn't easy to do.
No. Someone like John Carpenter or Wes Craven, you've got a body of work that is mixed, but more standout hits than others, whereas Tobe Hooper is he's so hard to classify, he's so hard to nail down, and his body of work ranges from genre-defining to kind of forgotten but underrated to straight up, I'll say it, really bad movies. He's made some movies that flat out didn't work on any level. But this is also the guy that did Poltergeist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So it's been interesting revisiting some of his lesser known works to try to fill out the gaps in this episode.
And just to familiarize myself a little bit more with somebody who I'm not very familiar with.
He definitely has a distinct style in his best work, I think.
He is no longer with us.
No.
He passed away in 2017 from natural causes. He was nearly 75.
Are they going to get to the bottom of natural causes eventually? Because every year that kills just so many people.
Let's hope that they never get to the bottom of it and just let people pass away of natural causes.
Yeah. And some people sooner than others, preferably.
But Tobe Hooper, he said that he loved movies from like the day that he could go to the movies.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's very clear. Yeah.
He said after school he would go to the movies and see 2 or 3 movies a day if he could.
Whoa.
And he would run from one theater to another.
Oh,
and he would stay in the
I've never
same
done that.
theater and watch the same movie again. And that's how he sort of started to hone his interest and like really learn how to make a movie.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And you can tell from, honestly, his earlier efforts and some of his best efforts, they all have this incredible grindhouse guerrilla filmmaking, you know, like we're doing this on the razor margins by ourselves, you know, here and there when we can on no budget. And
he grew up in Texas.
Yeah, Austin,
and,
I think.
And when he moved to Dallas and went to the University of Texas, he said that it was a very like lively environment of the film school, of where they would attack Hollywood films and people would scream and cheer at the screen. And he said that, you know, he adapted to that environment, but notoriously, and from what I've been reading about him, he wasn't that aggressive on set. Maybe later in his filmatic career he was, but early on he definitely took sort of a backseat, which I will get into when I talk about one of the movies.
Okay.
But before he became a director, got into the film industry, he was a college professor.
Yes, he came to
60s.
filmmaking through an interesting route. He was an intellectual, a college professor. He was definitely part of the movement that was pushing American filmmaking away from the sort of censorship and like the Catholic Commission that had dominated, you know, for decades, into more grungy, you know, realistic filmmaking. People like Sam Peckinpah, you know, really pushing the envelope in the 60s away from the sort of cookie cutter, like happy ending filmmaking that had been dominating. And Tobe Hooper his breakout came out of an era right after George Romero had done Night of the Living Dead, right after Wes Craven had done Last House on the Left, which were pushing the horror genre into very dark and realistic places.
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, when he was a college professor, he was also a documentary cameraman. But in 1974, he got a small cast of college professors and students, including Kim Henkel, who he was the co-writer of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And
later wrote and directed the classic installment Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the Next Generation, which was the early film effort from both Renee Zellweger and Matthew McConaughey.
Wow.
Yeah, for real. Go watch that. It is terrible.
But Tobe Hooper said that Texas Chainsaw Massacre came as a reaction to what was going on at the time. He studied what made horror movies work and decided to place like a story within the atmosphere of death. And he wanted to set up this creepy atmosphere of where the first scene starts in a graveyard. And when he conceived of this idea, the local news in San Antonio was focusing on car accidents and showing bodies in the streets. And there was a popular song called Dead Skunk in the Middle of the Road.
Oh, yeah, that one.
So this all sort of led him to work with Kim Henkel on creating this pretty dark screenplay.
You know, it's weird. Every time I've watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I've watched it a few times, I have wondered if it had anything to do with dead skunk
in the streets,
in the middle of the highway.
Yeah.
And now I have that confirmed. Yeah.
Now think about it.
Thank you, Kim Henkel.
Later, he was offered E.T., but turned it down. And so Spielberg did it himself and then suggested that Tobe Hooper direct Poltergeist, which he did. We'll talk about that later. he then went on to do Life Force, Invaders from Mars, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which were all part of like a trilogy that he was contractually obligated to do through the production company. And then from there, you know, he had some box office failures of the aforementioned couple of the aforementioned movies, and he ended up moving more towards TV and like short filmatic specials. He directed about 40 projects in his life. He also directed the well-regarded Salem's Lot miniseries.
Oh, hell yeah. So good.
In 1979.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, some of the flops just didn't make him a well sought after director.
Well, it's very, I think it's Tobe Hooper's career is like a play told in 3 acts. You have his early days where his, you know, grindhouse guerrilla style really shines through, and that never left, honestly. We'll talk about it when we get into his films, but there are certain stylistic themes and choices and narrative themes that are pervasive throughout most of his filmography. Then you have his commercial era, which was the early to mid 80s, where he was directing with bigger budgets. Not all of those were hits. And that was the time when I think Hollywood was really struggling with Tobe Hooper, because Tobe Hooper was not a commercial filmmaker, but he had made some movies that were successful. So,
and then he was contractually obligated to make these 3 films.
Basically, he was a victim of, you know, the mid 80s when studios really reasserted control over their films. Tobe Hooper was someone who was really designed to make films in the kind of lawless era of the late 60s and the 1970s, where, you know, filmmakers were given unprecedented creative control, and then Michael Cimino kind of ruined that with Heaven's Gate. But
well, I'll get into that when we talk about Life Force, because that was quite chopped up.
It's a perfect example of Hollywood throwing money at somebody they didn't quite understand, and then not liking what came out because it wasn't commercial. It was Tobe Hooper. He was a very specific filmmaker, and I don't think he ever hid that from anybody, but this was the time when his work really started to suffer, and for the rest of his career, he had a lot of trouble finding financing.
It's almost like Tobe Hooper peaked in the wrong decade.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because if he were making film now, maybe it would be different.
Maybe.
Or in the 50s and 60s.
You know, if he had been given the same amount of control he was allowed on, you know, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Fun House and things like that, then we would have had a very different outcome. You can tell in his middle and later work, you can sense the tension between his sensibilities and the studio's, you know, wants and needs. And listen, it never ends well when a studio meddles too deeply into a movie. Like, give me one example where a studio's taken over from a creative and it's made it better.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work that way.
I just don't think Tobe Hooper ever really was brought to a level to show his best. Until
now, folks, because we're giving the man his due right here, Terror in Tandem. There's a sadness in examining Tobe Hooper's work because his genius is right there in front of you. His point of view is unique and refreshing. Especially when compared to a lot of his contemporaries. And yet, you're absolutely right. I kind of wish he had been in a more, you know, fertile environment with friendlier financiers, with more imagination, because he was a brilliant guy who was hampered by commercialism, in my opinion. And later on in his career, it kind of seemed to take the wind out of his sails, where his later movies really didn't even have the same passion that his earlier films. They kind of felt like they thudded.
Yeah.
Well,
why don't you talk about what you're going to talk about?
Oh, goodness.
Regarding like one of his earliest.
So, you know,
because we all know what it's going to be.
Obviously, the thing about Tobe Hooper is he has a style that is not as easy to pin down as, say, like John Carpenter or, even like Ari Aster, so, or Robert Eggers, more contemporary filmmakers. Tobe Hooper's style was a little bit more subtle, but a few things really pop up in his best work. One of those things is class struggle. Class struggle plays a big role in his movies, and it's a class struggle that goes both ways. Most filmmakers tend to focus on one side of it, but in Tobe Hooper's movies, everyone is shitty to everyone. So this first pops up in Texas Chainsaw Massacre alongside his other running theme, which is sweatiness. His movies are sweaty. His best movies, in my opinion, are, you can feel the sort of heat and the sweat and the fear and the like desperation that the characters go through as they...
You mean like gritty?
Yes. Well, no, they are literally sweaty, but yeah, they're gritty. Even his use of his cinematography, the film grain, especially in Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Eaten Alive. But even when he was making more commercial films like Poltergeist, there was a dirtiness, a griminess, a grittiness to his film work. His characters are often hot, sweaty, dirty, crawling through something.
Well, especially Poltergeist, it takes place in the summer.
Exactly. Eaten Alive is like that. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a lot of his movies take place in sweltering heat. And I think that's a product of growing up in Texas, where it's pretty hot.
Yeah, right.
Right. So obviously, I'm going to talk about his breakout film. That's not 1969's Eggshells. That was his first movie. But his real first success was, as you mentioned, 1974's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The
year I was born, or was it?
Talk about deep dives. This movie, it's not just one of the greatest horror movies ever made. It is one of the best movies ever made, I would contend. It was done on a shoestring budget by a couple of nobodies.
Yeah, I just told you.
Yeah.
Students and other teachers
and
from
you can
the University of Texas.
Feel that in every frame. Just the absolute passion and dedication of a crew filming with no money in sweltering Texas, in the middle of summer. So you probably know the story. A group of young co-eds looking for a place they shouldn't go are traveling through Texas, and they end up at Leatherface's house, and the whole family. That's the thing. It's not just Leatherface. It's the crazy uncle. It's grandpa. It's the whole gang.
Yeah.
So it all starts when they pick up a drifter who they really shouldn't have picked up, and you get that sense of tension right away that these kind of rich yuppie kids are definitely looking down at this hillbilly like creep that they just picked up. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't, because I did just call this guy a hillbilly creep, and he is a murderer. But their disdain for the locals is very clear, and that is something that Tobe Hooper does a lot in his movies. He draws a very distinct line between class divisions, and he shows the tension. And he shows it both ways, because let me tell you, as snooty and rude as these yuppie kids might be, they definitely don't deserve what happens to them.
Right.
So you see the class struggle from the other side of the lower class taking its revenge. And that comes up again in Eaten Alive and in other films of this sort of downtrodden rural folk who's sick and tired of being looked down on. And there is some sympathy there, but they're usually also the kind of villains of the film. Texas Chainsaw Massacre it's surprisingly not very gory.
No.
I think a lot of people have built up in their minds that this is a gore fest. It is not. To the degree that Tobe Hooper was convinced they were going to get a PG rating. PG-13 didn't exist at the time.
Yeah, I know.
He thought he was going to get PG. The MPAA said this is an X-rated movie, so he cut a little bit here and there, but that, I think, is such a testament to how disturbing this fucking movie is. There's very little blood and guts in it, and yet it is one of the scariest, most get-under-your-skin disturbing movies ever filmed.
Well, it has that relentless nature of, these kids aren't getting out alive.
Oh, I mean, from the first frame, yeah. He also doesn't spare Franklin, the one disabled character, who gets chainsawed in his wheelchair.
Yeah.
After getting, kind of thrown down a hill for a while. Franklin has it rough. He is a whiny bitch, but he does have it rough.
I feel like one of my recommendations from May, In a Violent Nature,
oh, yes.
from the perspective of the killer film, I feel like that
just came out,
has the closest visual vibe.
Yes,
that
I agree.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, has. Like, we haven't really seen a dusty, sweaty, gritty movie.
Well, here's the thing.
Like that. Like
every time someone tries
a serial killer slasher, I guess we would call it, because it's a chainsaw.
It's a slasher.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
they're much more polished these
every
days.
time
you know
someone tries to do it, it's like you can tell they're play acting. You know, this is an authentically gritty movie because it stars unknown actors in the middle of a fucking swamp in Texas in July.
Yeah.
And they're dirty because they're actually dirty, and they are sweaty because they're all really hot. And, you know, that's why the authenticity comes through.
It also has that cinematography quality of the like yellowing.
Well, yeah, it was shot on, you know, low grade film stock. So it has a very gritty, grainy feel to it, which really adds to the atmosphere. And even when they remade Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 2003 with Jessica Biel,
better looking people.
That's it. It's Jessica
people,
Biel,
polished cinematography.
Yes. And it's Jessica Biel sitting in a makeup tent getting fake dirt put on her face, as opposed to the original cast, you know, really going through it. And I'm not saying you need to abuse your actors to get an authentic film. I'm not trying to Stanley Kubrick poor Jessica Biel, but you can tell the difference of like, oh, you're a bunch of gorgeous modern people pretending to be, you know, gross.
Yeah.
But the introduction of Leatherface, which comes after a good while in the movie, honestly, he's not there at the beginning. It's one of the best introductions of a villain ever. He doesn't say anything. There's very little sound. His victim buys it real quickly, and it's just Leatherface's enormous presence, the squealing pig sound he makes, and the horrible like reality of the violence. There's not a lot of blood, but after he smacks that guy in the head with the hammer and his body starts twitching, you know, it's really brutal. And slamming that metal door closed, God fucking knows what's behind there. I mean, we find out later, but that is such a shocking, horrifying moment with almost no blood. And in that moment, you can see why censors were like, holy Christ.
Yeah.
But it's a moment of just kicking the doors open and screaming that you have arrived. But Tobe Hooper I don't think he realized that at the time. He was so unassuming, and it didn't really have like a bombastic personality like some other directors.
I know that you made like light of Dead Skunk in the Middle of the Road, but I feel like it's really fitting to the roadkill vibe.
Oh, they do eat roadkill in this movie.
Yeah.
And also people
kill.
People kill.
I mean, it's very much like what you would expect a sort of family who lives the way they live.
Yeah.
And how they would take care of outsiders. You know, it's very
all depictions of the hillbilly cannibal family come from this.
Yeah.
I mean, this and The Hills Have Eyes from Wes Craven, which is around the same time. But this is the archetype for the crazy group of hillbillies that, you know, will kill anybody that comes near them. And in their defense, right at the beginning, the old crazy gas station guy does warn these kids, don't go to that fucking house.
You know what Richard always says?
I think longtime listeners know how I feel.
Guy.
I don't care how much dirt and oil he has on his face or how old he is or crazy looking or smelly.
It's interesting because we have a full service place nearby, and I wonder if Richard would listen to him.
Well, if he started telling me not to go to the specific place I'm headed because everyone who goes there gets, you know, eaten,
hopefully we never have to find out.
No, normally he's just telling me something about the border or like vaccines, and I'm not interested. But so this movie, it left an indelible mark on me. The first time I saw it, I was, maybe 16 or 17. And the scene where poor Sally is tied up at family dinner and they cut her finger and Grandpa put it in Grandpa's mouth and you realize Grandpa's not dead. The whole time you thought Grandpa was a corpse. That scared me so badly when it first happened. I remember I sank into my chair. I couldn't move. I had like an absolute paralysis fear response. I was so scared. I remember being so scared in that moment that I tipped over the runaway screaming part and I went past that into the completely like primal fetal position fear. And I just sat there.
He pooped his pants.
No. I maintained control of all sphincter muscles. But I just remember I had to rewind the VHS because I missed like the next few minutes. I was in a stupor. It was, and it's still effective. Also, really quick before I forget it, let's not forget this movie has an introduction voiceover by none other than John Larroquette, which is wild to me. I mean, it's 1974. John Larroquette, not known for his horror output, narrating the greatest, scariest horror movie that's ever come out. I mean, that's a pretty wild piece of trivia. And he did come back and do it for the remake also.
Awesome.
So, yeah, that's 1974's Texas Chainsaw. Look, just watch it. It's one of the best for a reason.
I've only watched it once, and that's plenty.
Oh, goodness. No, you must watch it again. Many more times.
No,
Many
thank
more
you.
times.
I don't like any of the things that you said. Hot, dirt, sweat.
Maggots. Lots of maggots.
I know.
Yeah.
It's also a lot of like
squishy.
The decor of the home.
Oh, you're not into taxidermy chic? into haute animal bones?
No, thank you.
Yeah, no, everything there is made out of animal bones because Henkel and Hooper took a lot of inspiration for the Leatherface family from real life killer Ed Gein.
Yeah.
Which there's a connection I'm going to bring up when we talk about another movie, but Ed Gein was a real guy in the 50s who would, skin his victims and make people suits out of them and dance naked wearing the suits under the full moon. Also the inspiration for Buffalo Bill, obviously. But good old Ed Gein. Remember the 50s when everything was so wholesome and nice and people were nice and nothing freaky happened?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool.
People just buried them in their backyards
Yep.
and nobody cared.
Yeah.
Oh, look at those roses. So mine is going to be Poltergeist, obviously.
Oh, for
It's
sure.
going to be Poltergeist. And we've talked about Poltergeist a lot.
Not Poultrygeist.
No. Right. 1982, written and produced by Steven Spielberg. Again, I mentioned that he sort of gave it to Tobe Hooper. And there is a lot of controversy around this.
Yes.
Tobe Hooper's involvement specifically as director. And I'll speak on that in a minute.
I will too.
But, this is definitely a classic in the horror genre. It's about a family dealing with a haunted house, starring Jo Beth Williams and Craig T. Nelson, among others.
Jo Beth Williams as the greatest mom in all of horror? Yes.
I would say that this is probably the most successful and highest grossing film that Tobe Hooper was involved with. And so, as I mentioned, his involvement is controversial because there was a lot of rumor and speculation that Tobe Hooper wasn't the sole director, that Steven Spielberg also was the director, that it was really Steven Spielberg's vision and storyboarding and Tobe Hooper just executed the day-to-day of it. Regardless of that, though.
I call bullshit on that for a couple of reasons. Steven Spielberg never in his fucking life would shoot a scene like the ripping your face off in the mirror scene.
Yeah.
He's not capable of that level of like fear and horror. No shade on Spielberg, but that's just not his thing.
Yeah, it's the practical effects that really make it stand out as
also
a Tobe Hooper film.
The very in-your-face classism of the movie of building your bougie fucking housing development on top of a cemetery you didn't even bother to move, because fuck those people, right? It's all about making the monies. And the real villain of the movie is the lying housing developer. You know?
I mean, listen, Steven Spielberg produced the movie. He was involved, but Tobe Hooper actually got to utilize some special effects, and he had a very clear vision of what this was going to be about and how it was going to play out. And also, like, the suburban, smug, elitist attitude in this very cookie cutter, every house is similar neighborhood, you know, new build. That is very much a Tobe Hooper thing.
Yeah, Craig T. Nelson and Jo Beth Williams, they are NIMBY, yuppie parents who, because tragedy hits them personally, they then learn their lesson and come to, you know, the right conclusion at the end of. But you have to wonder, if that had happened to their neighbor, would they have given a shit?
Right.
Do they only care because it happened directly to them? And that is classic Tobe Hooper.
I don't know if we mentioned this before, but the word poltergeist comes from the German for noisy ghost.
Ah, yeah.
You keep it down, poltergeist.
So what's with all the slamming of the cabinets?
Real human skeletons were used in the pool scene.
What?
Yes, real human skeletons.
No way.
Were
I didn't
used
know
in
that.
the pool scene.
Okay, so when she's gulping down that Slurpee body water,
It gets worse.
that is real?
It gets worse.
Jo Beth.
So, since the crew decided it would be too complicated and too expensive to get fake ones, he had previously used real human skeletons in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So he decided to use it for Poltergeist as well.
Hold up.
Jo Beth Williams was not made aware of this until after the scene was finished.
Oh, so she was inadvertently slurping down body water.
Yeah.
Question. So between the 8 years...
I don't think it was the same.
Okay, so he didn't just like have
The concept
a
of using
storage closet
maybe,
where it was just
but
like old
like
skeletons.
literal skeletons in his closet.
Jesus, Toby. My goodness, what were you up to?
The house used
Also, first off, this movie is about the bad things that happens when you desecrate the dead.
Yeah.
And they desecrated the dead making the movie.
Well, maybe they were donated to science.
This isn't science.
I don't know. The house used to film this movie is located in Simi Valley, where it still stands today. The family who owned it sold it in May of 2009.
Yeah. It's probably really annoying to live in a famous house.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah.
Especially in Instagram days.
We've even been to the Brady Bunch house.
Of course.
We used to live in that neighborhood.
Yeah, we're not immune to being idiots.
And so Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg and the screenwriters were originally going to have Carol Ann killed in the first act and then haunt the house the rest of the film.
Yeah.
But they eventually decided it was too dark and opted to have her kidnapped by ghosts instead.
I'm going to refrain from making any off-color jokes there.
Carol Ann actually, when she was filming the scene where she's holding onto the bed and being sucked into the closet, was so traumatic for the actress that Steven Spielberg picked her up in his arms and basically calmed her and promised that she wouldn't ever have to film that scene again.
You know, there's a real mensch, that Steven Spielberg. And a key difference between Spielberg and his other bearded contemporary, Jonathan Landis, whose approach to child actors was a little different.
Yeah. So there was a lot of dark elements removed from the final cut of this film.
Which is unfortunate.
Steven Spielberg wanted a PG rating
Yeah.
because he wanted it to be a double feature with E.T. that he was filming at the time. And so that there was only one death in the final movie and a couple of injuries. But the original version, at least Tobe Hooper's version, was much more violent.
I'm telling you, that is right in my movies that never got made heaven room. Where I get to sit and watch movies that never got made. That's one of them. Jodorowsky's Dune. George Miller's Justice
Well, this
League.
happened a lot with Tobe Hooper films.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He dropped out of movies. He got kicked off of movies. I just watched a movie that he got kicked off of called Venom. We're going to be talking about in future.
That's why he
update,
didn't want to
but-
do E.T. He was like,
Yeah.
no.
Well, he was starting to understand that he was never going to get the creative freedom that he really wanted if he didn't make his own movies.
Zelda Rubinstein said in many interviews that she did not like Tobe Hooper.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
She did not like him at all.
Yeah?
She said she made many comments about his drug problems, including when she was auditioning that she said, well, Tobe Hooper was there, but he wasn't really there.
Yikes. Well, it's the 80s and Hollywood.
Yeah. So, Poltergeist
His
in
nose
general
is
has a
not
lot
clean.
of darkness around it.
Yeah.
2 people in the film were murdered. One, the daughter, the teenage daughter was murdered in the driveway.
She was. Yeah.
And then one of the other men in the film was murdered, who he was also in Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2.
Oh.
He was in this as well. And he was sadly murdered, like, I think in his 60s.
I mean, not to mention Heather O'Rourke passing away tragically after the 3rd movie.
Yeah, she was like, she got like some sort of sickness.
The
illness.
actor playing the preacher in the 2nd movie dying of cancer while they were filming. This is not an easy franchise to be in.
No, and it might all lead back to Tobe Hooper's decision to use real human skeletons.
Yeah. Oh, we're picking up on something here. It's, again, amazing to me. Tobe, you're making a movie about this exact thing you're doing.
Yeah. But it was very reflective of the time, the culture wars of TVs and constantly watching and honestly being sucked into media and TV
to
in
the
that
very
way.
unsubtle message of Craig T. Nelson rolling the TV out into the balcony in the final scene.
Yeah. But also the class of I'm moving, into this development to have a better life, and it's really just consecrated graves.
Yeah. And here's the thing
people
about
don't think and people don't care.
Yeah. And they just moved to another house.
And nobody cares, like, around them. You think those neighbors left? They didn't.
Yeah.
Where were the neighbors? Did neighbors ever come over and say,
the only time you
"Hey"?
ever see the neighbors is at the very end when the house is literally blowing apart.
I also think they had a party.
But
too.
there's not like they're not running out and helping at any other point.
No, cops aren't showing up.
No.
Fire trucks aren't. No.
Yeah, it's very.
It's all just like, oh, well, we leave them alone.
Yeah, you do your thing. It's not my problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was very 80s nuclear family, like dog
very
eat
much
dog
so.
kind of bullshit. All right, so you want to take a break?
Let's do it. When you're at your wit's end and you need a break, there's only one place you can turn to. The Bad Seed Babysitting Service, of course. With BSBS, you can cut the BS and get your little nightmare to shut the hell up while you get some much-needed fun. While you tear it up in town or just go to a parking lot to scream a while, our specialized sitters can bring your little demon to their knees. Our sitters can make any child behave. The harder they fight, the more our sitters thrive. They love a challenge and have yet to lose. Equipped with their special kit of secret tools, which we can never reveal, the Bad Seed Babysitters will put your child down, so you don't have to. We do not claim to have any training, certifications, or licensure. Our sitters are not responsible for death or dismemberment. This is a fake ad for a fake product on a horror-themed podcast. We do not condone nor endorse the people with murderous tendencies who get into the caregiving trade.
Welcome back.
Hi.
Hi. So, moving on from those, my next film that I'm going to talk about is 1981's The Funhouse. Now, this is the movie that paved the way for Poltergeist because it was Tobe Hooper's first studio film.
Face melting?
Yeah. So, this movie it's kind of a forgotten classic. I deeply love this movie because it has a lot of the elements of the classic, scary looking slasher, killing teenagers, but it's very atypical of other films in that era because Tobe Hooper is Tobe Hooper. He spends the first 40 minutes of this movie introducing you to these teenagers who are pretty fucking awful. They so they're a bunch of rich white kids from the suburbs who go to a carnival that is run by carnies who, are dirty and weird and have this weird kind of culture amongst them. And they have deformed animals and freak show and all those things. And there's a nudie tent of an over 21 show. But these
of course,
teenagers
Tobe Hooper loves those boobs.
Well, yeah, there's boob shot. In the first 10 seconds of this movie, there's a boob shot. And you're like, okay, Tobe Hooper likes a few things in life. Boobs are one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Now these teenagers
Boobs are two of them.
They go through this carnival in the shittiest way possible. They are just sneering, making jokes at people's expense, looking down on everybody, just being awful. And if you're watching them, you're like, fuck these kids. They're the worst. That being said, they don't necessarily deserve what happens to them. So, group of teenagers go to the carnival. They decide to stay overnight in the funhouse. After being shitheads to everybody, they harass.
They're like, yeah, I want to be around these people more.
Well, the worst part, they harass this fortune teller as she's giving a fortune to one of them, the only quote-unquote good one. Elizabeth Barrett, she's the final girl. So as she's giving the fortune, they're making jokes and yelling at her and being horrible. And also they do the worst possible thing that anyone can do, which is smoke pot. Yeah, they do. You know what? I take it back. They did deserve what they got. Yeah, so anyway, after being dicks to all these crazy carnies, they decide to spend the night in the scary funhouse that they just went through. And while they're getting it on with each other, they start to hear something, and they look down through the floorboards, and they see...
Nothing makes me hornier than putting down a bunch of people that I think are below me.
Absolutely. And then spending the night in a dirty, half broken down funhouse with weird animatronics. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow, hot.
I'm hard just thinking about it.
Ew.
So anyway,
Richard.
So they notice one of the carnies wearing a Frankenstein monster mask is below them in a room, and he's got a hooker with him. So he pays the hooker with money that he stole from the carnival, and they get it on for 2 seconds because the monster finishes. So the monster wants his money back. The hooker doesn't want to give it back, so the monster kills the hooker, and the kids see it, and then the monster notices that the kids watch. So basically they saw the murder, and now he stalks them, wearing this mask that when they take it off, they see his horribly fucked up, deformed, albino, red-eyed, crazy face. He kind of looks like Pennywise, sort of, but worse.
No makeup?
Well, there's a lot of makeup, but yeah, his character, yeah, no makeup. So he's like a deformed monster, going by the all-time name of Gunther Twibund. That's a name. So, yeah, he's all messed up, and he starts stalking the kids, and then his father, who owns the carnival, Gunther's father, finds him, and he's like one of those kind of Texas Chainsaw weird hillbilly, beating his son, but also helping him kill people. So, yeah, they fights the teens and dispatches them one by one, but it has this really great ending of, the final girl stumbling out, Amy, stumbling out, traumatized. And I will say, I'm using the term final girl kind of generously here because Amy doesn't so much survive as last. It's not like she really does anything to save herself. She just sort of really gets lucky a bunch of times, and then everyone else just sort of gets killed first. So Amy just sort of makes it to the end. Everybody gets dispatched by other people who then die. And she stumbles out, and this horrid-looking animatronic of this huge fat woman, like in a freak show, is laughing at her. And while she's walking out, the carnies are setting up, like breaking down the tents to move on to the next town, and they're just going about their business. And she's like stumbling through, dirty and bloody and all like glassy-eyed and traumatized, and the carnies are just getting ready for the next show. So it's got that bleak Tobe Hooper sensibility of class struggle and, look what happens when you treat people badly. But on the other end, there are moments in this movie where, the working class or the rural folks are downright shitty to the suburban class. So it cuts both ways. And
a lot of like punching down because that carny with the mask.
There's a lot of that. There are layers and layers. And what Tobe Hooper does a good job, and this is a real life phenomenon, is class struggle is not as black and white as media might cut it out. It's not rich versus poor, because, sorry to tell you, rich people treat each other like shit too. Poor people also treat each other like shit too. Yeah. It's much more complicated.
If you're poor and there's somebody like
lesser,
worse off than you or less sophisticated than what you deem
there's
to
always
be
a pecking order. There's always a caste system, a classification.
The punching down.
No matter how low in life you are, there's a compunction to seek out someone lower than you and step on them.
How many times have you heard that justification of when you're feeling bad about something? Well, at least you don't have it as bad as so-and-so.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, like, that's supposed to make you feel better.
Or like eat the food in front of you.
That always just bummed me out.
Starving elsewhere.
I know.
Well, like, shouldn't we talk about this?
Yeah. I remember being a kid and being told that and being like, well, that's terrible. Why are we letting this happen? I'm also still not eating this broccoli. But Funhouse it's not
fun.
No, it's not overly gory, but like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it has a griminess and an uncomfortable level of realism that you're just like, God damn. It's also not easy to root for these kids because they're shits for like 40 minutes before the action starts kicking off. That being said, they still don't deserve axes in the head. Yeah. That's rough. Maybe a lesson or some detention. But anyway, there's got to be a middle road. I really like the Funhouse. It was sort of a modest hit. It did well enough for Tobe Hooper to get Poltergeist. But, it was, I think, an era before Tobe Hooper had become ground down by Hollywood when he was still trying to prove himself. So it really stands out for me, the Funhouse, amongst other slashers of the era, because it does have something to say. And another one of Tobe Hooper's classic themes that he explores in a few movies are adults being really shitty to kids.
Yeah.
There are moments in this movie, like when Amy's little brother, gets stopped by a guy, in a pickup truck who offers him a ride and then points a loaded gun at him and just starts laughing. It's just, there are these weird moments of just adults behaving badly and being shitty to children. And that was something Tobe Hooper explored a lot in his movies, and good on him for that.
Well, let's talk about the next film, which is 1985's Life Force.
Yeah.
Starring Steve Railsback, Matilda May, Frank Finley, and Sir Patrick Stewart.
A pre-Picard.
Yeah, pre-Sird.
Yeah. This is before Picard and Professor X. And I said there was a Ed Gein connection. Steve Railsback, who plays the lead in this movie, played Ed Gein in the 1995 film Ed Gein, which is actually really good.
I do want to say that I think that this is an attempt by Tobe Hooper to make the film he wanted to make.
Oh, yeah. It was the biggest budget he'd ever gotten.
Yeah. And just to let you know, it's sci-fi horror. A trio of space vampires suck energy rather than blood.
Known as Life Force.
Found in the tail of Halley's Comet, are inadvertently brought to London and get loose, infecting the population and threatening the entire world.
And let me tell you, these space vampires love sucking Life Force just as much as they hate wearing clothes.
Well, especially Matilda May. There's a lot of stuff about the whole nudity. Matilda May is a French actress. Originally, I believe Olivia Hussey was cast, but she didn't want to be nude like that.
Which is Olivia Hussey has appeared nude in films, but I don't think she spent the majority of her screen time completely naked the way Matilda May does.
If you're really interested, you can read about sort of the lengths that Tobe Hooper went to make sure that Matilda May's nudity and lack of hair and that kind of stuff was done to his liking. I
Is
would
it okay
say
if I don't read that stuff?
Versions on the inappropriate, but not. Matilda May was fine with it all. So fine with it all that she never wore clothes, even between scenes.
Yeah.
Because she really wanted everybody to be comfortable with her naked body because she was going to be spending the whole film totally naked.
I don't mean to be stereotypical, but obviously she's French.
A lot of the other actors had a really hard time with her being nude in between scenes, and they just constantly had to force themselves to like look her in the eye,
which is, I think, exactly the point she was trying to make.
She's very attractive,
but also that does say a lot about people. Like, why can't you look at a body? Everyone has them. What have we done to ourselves that we feel such shame and aversion to looking at each other? This
is a very hammy film.
You and I had very different reactions to it.
This is very much, it is pretty outrageous. It's space vampires, so it's
based
an
on a novel called Space Vampires.
Yeah, it's an outlandish premise, and I think that the acting from some folks, especially Frank Finlay, it's a lot of over the top, but what I think this does really well is highlights, like I said, what Tobe Hooper really wanted to communicate with his special effects and his desire to make something really different. His director's cut was 2 hours and 8 minutes.
I would do anything to see that.
And then the movie and how it was put out was cut down to 1 hour and 56 minutes.
What?
So
an absolute shame.
The cuts were mostly scenes set on the spaceship, the Churchill,
which is amazing. Okay, first off, this movie was written by Dan O'Bannon, who also wrote Alien. Yes. And you can see a lot of that in there, especially when they explore the space vampire ship, which is like a living,
called the Churchill,
bioorganic kind of construction.
Yeah, it's very strange.
It's amazing. It's like it kind of looks like Fantastic Voyage, where they're inside the human body.
Yeah, I thought it was Fantastic Voyage from the start.
Yeah,
I was like, wait a minute, I've seen this.
It's very influenced by that because there's the scene where they're going through the hallways and they look like arteries.
The original unedited European version of this film contains more violent and erotic footage.
Ooh.
It also contains the full Henry Mancini score in place of the Michael Kamen music.
I was going to say Henry Mancini wrote the score to this movie. Pink Panther himself.
Yeah.
This is an oddity, this movie.
It is an oddity.
It is absolutely strange.
It's it's like what I just said, which is a sci-fi horror about space vampires.
We haven't even touched on what fucking Patrick Stewart is doing in this movie.
Patrick Stewart said many, many times in many interviews that Tobe Hooper was one of his favorite directors to work with, which is a high compliment.
From Sir Patrick?
And
imagine being complimented by Patrick Stewart. That must feel really good.
He also hoped to cast Billy Idol as the second vampire, but his touring dates conflicted with the shooting schedule.
That would have been dope. Oh my God.
And he said that the film is about men dealing with the feminine mystique or feminine terror, as well as men dealing with the feminine inside themselves, which I think is a really interesting draw from the film, that if you are able to be a little bit more deep in your analysis of this film, that you'll definitely see that, because there is a lot of like the sucking of the life force of someone is a very intimate process, and it doesn't have any gender lines. So you'll see men sucking life force from other men. Yeah. And it's a very intimate thing.
And the male vampires have a sort of like Ziggy Stardust look about them. They're a little androgynous. Yeah. They skirt the line.
They're all very, very attractive. I mean, the male vampires were like
Yeah,
models.
but they're attractive in that sort of way that transcends, I
Waxy.
think, sex, where it's like it's more an aesthetic perfection of the form. It's not even sexualized, or it's maybe sexualized, but like it's genderless.
Yes.
It's just the form.
Well, it's the spectrum that is on the gender fluidity spectrum, that we all have
because
feminine
these are
and
aliens.
masculine qualities.
I just on a personal note, I'm always so frustrated when sci-fi writers write a species that is supposed to be utterly alien to humanity, but they have a binary gender system, and you're just like, okay, and they're all heterosexual or cisgendered. You're like, but they're fucking aliens. Like, why would they be so much like, oh, you have no imagination? That's why.
I do think that this movie was ahead of its time.
Oh, 100%. No one knew what to make of this.
And because of, the outlandish overacting by some of the people in the film.
Not Stephen Railsback. You are an undersung
Frank
gem.
Finlay.
Yeah, I know.
It did take away, I think, from maybe a little bit of the depth of the film. I think maybe if it was made even 10 years later,
maybe
it would have had a different impact. I don't think that Tobe Hooper was able to fully explore some of the gender switching and fluidity of what
this
he
movie
had originally intended.
This movie kind of ruined Tobe Hooper. He fought with the studio constantly. It was, his original vision wasn't released. It disillusioned him, and also the studio. I think the studios and the whole system at this point pretty much gave up on Tobe Hooper. They're like, he's never going to make the movie we want him to make. He's too much of a wild card.
Yeah. But it's a sort of a cult classic.
I love it.
A strange additive to Tobe Hooper's overall filmography. I definitely think it's worth a watch. It is very strange. But, I think if you can look at it from the filmmaking aspect and to see what Tobe Hooper's intention was behind it, that you might get something different out of it than just the superficial space vampires.
I think it helps as well if you're already a Tobe Hooper fan.
Sure. Yeah.
I admit this movie is a swing and a miss, but my affection for it, I think, stems from how Tobe Hooper it all is and how much I admire his adventurousness and his daring, his ability to, wrestle with studio heads and put these subversive elements in his films and get them out to the masses. I have a deep respect for that. And this movie is campy and goofy, and it doesn't work on some levels, but it's such a creative swing for the fences. And
I feel like this was his last swing for the fences, honestly.
He had he had a couple of pretty good movies, but he never again reached the same heights, both in attempt and execution. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, what's your last one?
The last one I'm going to talk about today is another. So 1986 was a busy time for Tobe Hooper. He released Invaders from Mars, which was a remake of a kind of forgotten 1950s sci-fi movie. And he released Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which, again, a lot of people really didn't know what to make of this. And the reason for that is this movie came 12 years after the original. It follows Dennis Hopper, who plays the uncle of Franklin and Sally from the original movie, out for revenge. And it stars the same cast. So the crazy family, they're all back. But it's a dark comedy. It's not a horror movie. Unlike the first movie, it is very graphic and gory. It's over the top. And from the beginning, it was pretty clear that this was a comedy because the fucking poster for the movie features the Leatherface family posing exactly like the Breakfast Club. Mm-hmm. So I think if you saw that on your way into the theater and you were surprised at the movie you just watched, maybe you need to pay attention. But it's a really weird movie. It's on one level, if you view it as its own thing, it's pretty rad. Dennis Hopper is essentially the villain of the movie, even though he's supposed to be the good guy. He's like, if you gave his character from Blue Velvet a cowboy hat and a chainsaw and set him loose. He is like over the top and nuts. He has a chainsaw fight with Leatherface in it. It's got that classic line of, dog will hunt. It's been sampled by everybody from Primus, it's been like replayed. Images from this movie have made their way into the mainstream, but the movie itself is strange. It's a dark, gory satire, but audiences really did not understand that. What they were, I think, reasonably expecting was a sequel to The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because this is called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2.
Yeah.
I enjoy this movie because it is utterly bonkers, and because Dennis Hopper fights Leatherface with a chainsaw. That's not nothing. Taken on its own, I completely understand why people would watch this movie and go, what the fuck is this? Because if you've seen the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre and you're expecting anything even close to that, no, that's not here. This is a satire on the excesses of Reaganism, on, again, class divisions between the rich and the rural. But also, Dennis Hopper, his character kind of reminds me of some contemporary politicians with their cowboy hats and their, the language they use and their peacocking and bullshit machismo. There's a lot of that dripping in this movie. It was definitely a commentary on the excesses of Reaganism and that era, but that's not what people wanted to see. They wanted to see more scary. Yeah. So it was sort of a bomb. And in retrospect, it's been reevaluated, as a satire and as a comedy. And I think it's gained some traction there amongst, younger film watchers.
People watch it and love it and think, oh, yeah.
I saw it when I was a teenager. So it was, 13, 14 years after the movie came out. So I was watching it with the benefit of of history, of understanding what this movie was supposed to be. So I didn't have shattered expectations. But I get, if you went to see this in 1986 and were like, what the fuck was that? Understandable. But again, Tobe Hooper was a wild card. You couldn't nail him down. He makes a sequel to his breakout, most successful movie and what's considered by many to be one of the greatest horror movies ever made. And he comes out with this weird genre
it was
mashup.
A little bit of a fuck you too, because it's like Hollywood doesn't
way.
Accept me,
yes.
So I might as well just ruin my masterpiece.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because it was only later that I learned about, Tobe Hooper's backstory and his struggles, and watching it through that lens, it does feel like an extended middle finger to the studio system of okay, you want commercial?
This is what you wanted me to make. You wanted me to make a follow-up. But I'm making this.
Dennis Hopper, a major movie star, in this movie, which is full of action and big set pieces and chases and chainsaw fights, and it's all the bullshit Rambo crap that you folks love, right? Yeah. Let's do some cocaine and fight each other with chainsaws. So it definitely lacks the genre-defining gut punch of the first movie. But if you view it in the context in which Tobe Hooper intended, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
It's a wild ride, but I can't recommend it necessarily as a solid film on its own. It is a good commentary of the era, and it's an interesting addition in the Tobe Hooper canon. But it's one of those movies that if you watch it and you love it, great. If you watch it and you hate it, I totally understand why.
Right. I
personally really like this one, but it's never going to be in the same category for me as Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
So my last is two short films within a group of other short films. The first is Body Bags from 1993.
Yeah.
This was a John Carpenter collection of 3 short films, 3 little vignettes, of which he directed one, and Larry Sulkus, and then Tobe Hooper.
And of course, John Carpenter also played...
Yeah, he played the coroner who
the
introduces each segment and directs 2 of the stories, like I said.
It's so good.
The first and second. And believe it or not, what's interesting is Tobe Hooper also plays morgue worker number 2.
Yeah.
And he directs the last segment, which is called The Eye, or Baseball Man. And it stars Mark Hamill and Twiggy.
Yeah.
And also stars Roger Corman,
Oh,
as the doctor.
rest in peace, King. We recently lost one of the greats, ladies and gents.
This is a psychological thriller. It's about a minor league baseball player played by Mark Hamill who crashes his car and loses his right eye. And Twiggy plays his wife. And basically he gets an eye transplant, but it's not, it's it's in the hospital, but it's an off the books eye transplant. It's not really, nobody wants him to do it. Nobody wants the doctor to perform it.
The New York Times just did a big story on back alley eye transplants. It
wasn't back alley. It was actually done in a hospital, but nobody signed off on it. They just went rogue.
Unsanctioned organ transplants.
And what happens is Mark Hamill's character starts to see like murder and killing and digging of graves and these horrible, horrible things, and then also has the desire to kill and be violent and be aggressive. So basically he's seeing life or experiencing the experiences of where the eye came from. What's interesting, this segment is loosely based on a true story of Mark Hamill himself. In 1977, he was in a near fatal car wreck.
Oh, yeah.
Which fractured his nose, right eye socket, and cheekbone.
That's why he looks so different between Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back.
Yep.
He had his face put back together.
And so what's really interesting is also that, he brings this sort of experience to the film. He actually had to have 7 hours of reconstructive surgery in his face, which is a lot. So, I would say watch all three. They're really interesting. The first one is The Gas Station, and that's really great. The second one is Hair, which is like funny and weird and strange, like masculinity to its like most toxic, which is really fun. And then this Eye, it's dark, it's good. I really think that this stands out as a good intro to Tobe Hooper. So if you like it, if you like his vibe, you can explore a little bit more. And then the other short that I want to recommend is from I think 2 seasons of Masters of Horror. I think Tobe Hooper directed a couple episodes, but I'm just going to talk about The Dance of the Dead from 2005, written by Mick Garris and Richard Matheson. He wrote the original.
Not me.
And it was adapted for film by his son, Richard C. Matheson. Not Richard, this Richard. And it stars Jessica Lowndes, Jonathan Tucker, and Robert Englund. Yes, Freddy Krueger.
Yep.
And it's a post-apocalyptic, like nuclear terrorist attack and flesh-dissolving nuclear fallout has happened. And this teenager, played by Jessica Lowndes, named Peggy, she works at a diner, gets involved with a drug-fueled biker, played by Jonathan Tucker and his friends. And they go to the Doom Room, a punk rock nightclub where reanimated corpses from the nuclear attack perform, all hosted by Robert Englund.
Which is never a good sign. If you show up to a party hosted by Freddy, go somewhere else.
It's just it sounds exactly like it is. It's basically like parental rules being thwarted, corruption of youth, drug use, sex, nihilism. It's sort of that, I don't know. I feel like it had a little bit of Alice in Chains and The Crow, sort of that dark
goth
violence, goth. Yeah, right. Yeah. Wonderfully, this Terror in Tandem host found out something really exciting. Billy Corgan composed music for this episode.
Nice.
Which anybody knows me knows I love Smashing Pumpkins, and so I thought that was really interesting. And there's a lot of whiplash, visceral experiences in this film to stimulate a drug high. So I would say of all of the Tobe Hooper that I've watched, this one is probably the most cinematically disruptive. And it basically heightens the experience for people that are watching this, because it, like I said, has all these like weird flashback and like hallucinatory filmatic movements, framing, that kind of thing. So it's interesting. I mean, it brings us up to the 2000s. You know, you hadn't maybe seen much Tobe Hooper from the late 90s,
you know,
the mid 90s until...
There are really only 2 movies from his later era that I would even recommend watching. They're not super great, but they're better. The Toolbox Murders in 2004 and The Mortuary in 2005. The latter starring Denise Crosby.
Nothing really from the like early 90s.
Nothing hit the heights of his earlier work, and unfortunately, I haven't seen it, but his last work, which he shot in the UAE, was widely considered to be his worst movie.
Yeah.
Which is a bummer.
But yeah, so I would check those shorts out. You know, it gives you a little taste of the range that Tobe Hooper had. I would say, especially with The Eye, like I said, it's a more psychological thriller. And then with Dance of the Dead, it's a little bit more of a like drug-induced gothic nightmare.
Yeah.
Both are pretty good, and, you know, half hour, easy in, easy out.
Tobe Hooper's influence on filmmaking, also on the genre, it cannot be overstated. He may not be a household name like John Carpenter or other, you know, famous directors, but his influence is worldwide. I mean, Hideo Nakata, who directed Ring, stated that he was a major influence on him. You know, it's a Japanese filmmaker, you know, making movies in the 90s.
Yeah.
It greatly influenced by Tobe Hooper's work. His absolute punk rock style of filmmaking, of staying true to his vision, and of using film as a method of laying bare some very uncomfortable realities of American life, despite people saying we don't want to look at that, we just want to eat popcorn and watch movies. You know, he never compromised, even when it came at the expense of commercial success or his career. And despite the fact that not all of his movies were bangers, I just love that commitment to vision and to his, you know, principles. He was not willing to water down his movies to be successful in a way that I think some of his contemporaries did. And as a result, unfortunately, he did sort of fall into obscurity later on in his career.
Yeah,
but
sadly.
There is no denying the indelible mark that Tobe Hooper left.
And also what happened as a result of censoring or modifying his filmmaking creativity based on what studios wanted or what they thought was marketable. I really feel like he never was able to make any of the films he really wanted. With Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you know, is really his first big foray into filmmaking, and which is widely regarded as one of his best. And then with Poltergeist, it was sort of like that was already established for him to just earn his stars as a director. Then with Life Force, it was not well received. Yeah. But that was really him saying, I'm going to make the movie I want to make. And then I think that really just after that, it was just a break in any confidence that he had in himself.
I really agree with what
Hollywood
you said.
Had in him.
I agree with what you said earlier, that he was a man out of time. I think given a more forgiving landscape and maybe a more imaginative patron, he would have really flourished. Yeah. And it's sad to view it through that lens. But despite the cultural and financial resistance to his vision, Tobe Hooper still managed to produce not only some of the most memorable and frightening genre entries, but some of the most fun. Yeah. Like really awesome. Who else could direct the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist, which you can legit watch with your family?
He dreamed up Leatherface, so
yeah, have that. Yeah. Well, that was deep
dive on Tobe.
This was a really interesting episode to do because I think in other ones like Stephen King, John Carpenter, you and I have been much more unabashedly like, no, this is a genius and we love basically everything he does.
This is complicated.
Tobe Hooper is a much more complicated figure, and it was really great to give the man his due while like being honest and examining his failures and missed opportunities.
You know, so many times it's kind of a lucky strike when people are able to be in Hollywood and make successful careers of it. And this just goes to show that, you know, things can line up really well. You can hit the marks that you need to. But then when it comes time for you to really show your stuff, that maybe people aren't ready, or maybe there's too many edits that make your vision fall apart, or
it used to
somebody's overacting. It takes the film in a direction that
you take
was
that,
never
Frank Finley.
never intended.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for suggesting Tobe Hooper because it was interesting. You know, I watched some stuff that I didn't talk about a lot on this episode because I wanted to celebrate the stuff that worked more than the stuff that didn't.
Same. And I wasn't, you know, super familiar. And I familiarized myself with both the man and his work. And, you know, now I know.
Yeah. And now, so do you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Terror in Tandem is written, produced, and recorded by Laura and Richard Mathiasen, and edited and mixed by Richard Mathiasen. Our theme was written and performed by Carrie Denver, and all other music was written and performed by David Suspanic. All opinions expressed on this podcast are our own and should be taken as such. Thanks for listening, and please remember to give us a like, a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time. We're standing right behind you.